this computer. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. It is my pleasure and my honor to have three speakers with us today. Some people are in their morning, some people are in their midday, and I'm in my night. So greetings to you relative to your time of day. Everyone in the gallery will have an opportunity to interact with the speakers after they've done their presentations. That'll be the first part. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you can put your question or comment in the chat, and I will monitor the chat. And I will read off your question if you just write in there anonymous or anon if you want to be brief. If you're okay to ask your own question, I would ask that you do the thing in the chat that says raise your hand. There's a little thing that lets me know that somebody wants to ask their own question. You can put your questions in ahead of time. I'm just going to peruse them, but I'm not going to monitor. It's not like, oh, you know, you can ask whatever you want to ask. So, you know, it's still fairly closed. There shouldn't be any trolls, in other words. If you want to ask your question, but not have your video, you can turn your own video off and, you know, ask your question just, you know, out loud, just using the audio. But you are still allowed to ask a question if you prefer to remain anonymous, because after a week on my Patreon page, I will be posting this as public to YouTube. We're trying to, in my estimation, you know, pretty much we're clear that we're not going to forget this year. This is one of those years, just like, you know, AC and BC, before COVID and after COVID, you know, like everybody's going to remember this year. And I definitely take the advice of those who say, make it something that is going to be a positive memory. So for me, doing these friends along the way is one of the most positive things for me, simply because these really are friends. And when you think that the struggle is tough, it is. When you think that the trenches are deep, they are. But at the same time, it has been my pleasure and my honor to know some of the most amazing people. And the three ladies that we have with us, tongue in cheek, I can basically say this was my White History Month, because I did Michael first and now I'm doing these ladies. And also because as far as politics go, these are people in whom I have a tremendous amount of faith to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. They all know that Black Lives Matter. And I'm going to let them talk about really their journey to Islamic studies. And that may also overlap a little bit with their journey to Islam, but they're free to do that. And then a couple of things I've asked them to speak on. So we'll you know, let that flow. I would ask also that you wait till I acknowledge you for a question or a comment, and that's only because I'm trying to pretend like I'm in control, which I'm not, which is COVID's teaching all of us that we're not in control. But it just helps me to kind of keep tabs on it, that you ask me to acknowledge you, and then I will do that, and that way there won't be any double talk. After they speak, I'm going to give them an opportunity to comment or question back and forth to each other. And in that time also, I hope to make a few additional comments. I'm really tempted when I get friends on there to just talk about why they're so amazing. And so I have to rein myself in and let them speak first, and then I get to say something. So eventually I also get to speak, and then we'll do the questions and comments, and I'll be watching the chat. So put anything in there at any time that you feel motivated. I'm going to start with Julian Hammer. Julian Hammer teaches religious studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She specializes in the study of gender and sexuality in Islam, race and gender in US Muslim communities, as well as contemporary Muslim thought, activism, and practice. She's the author of several books, including Peaceful Families, American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence, American Muslim Women, Religious Authority and Activism, More Than a Prayer, and the co-author of A Jihad for Justice, The Work and Life of Amina Wadud, the Cambridge Companion to American Islam and Muslim Women and Gender Justice Concepts, Sources, and Histories. Julian, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I'll start by saying Bismillah, and then I want to gush a little bit and just talk about how honored I am to be considered one of your friends along the way, and how honored I am to be here and have this conversation with you, and I'm hoping for it to be a conversation. I will also admit that I'm really nervous. And it's my first public speaking engagement in, I don't know, 5 months, except for teaching. So all of this is coming together. I'm really giddy in a way that I don't usually know myself to be. So we were asked to talk about living the path, about our work, about Islamic studies, and the study of gender in Islam in the US Academy. And I want to start because we're talking about living the path, and say just a tiny little bit about myself that most people probably don't know. So I grew up in East Germany, in East Berlin, and started work as an activist, as a grassroots activist, both as a feminist and as a pro-Palestine activist as a teenager. And started Islamic studies in Berlin at Humboldt University when I was in my early 20s, and came to Islam in a circuitous sort of way, in the sense that I knew that I was looking for something, but I didn't really know what I was looking for. And so it took me until my late 20s to actually become Muslim. And within that time period, I also lived in Palestine for extended periods of time for research. So my research background early on was Palestine studies. And when I became Muslim, I think I just brought together things that I had experienced as already part of myself. One is, I think, a commitment to social justice. I think both the feminist piece and the Palestine activism piece point me towards the fact that I think we're inclined towards working for justice and that we're yearning for justice. And so I have always, I think, thought of my academic work as an important part of this. And so I will say a little bit more about what I've been working on and what I'm doing now, but also made a note to myself to make sure that I mention, and this has become incredibly important now, that a really important part of what I do is teaching undergraduates, which we all know is complicated, but also can be really rewarding. But I also train graduate students at UNC Chapel Hill in the religious studies program. And I think of my mentoring and training of graduate students actually as part of my activism, because it's become really important for me to help students and work with students to navigate an academic system that for many of them is not a good system, that doesn't work well for them. And so I see that as a really important part of the work that I do. I was thinking in preparing for this when you and I actually first met, and I think I figured it out. I first saw you in 2006 when you and Keisha did the One World book panel on both of your books at the American Academy of Religion. And I did introduce myself to you, but it was sort of this, you were a giant and I was this person from Germany who really had no idea what was happening most of the time. I also think now that it is interesting that I am part of this community, this collective now, but it actually took me quite some time to get there, because when I came to the US in 2002, the sort of what was then the sort of progressive Muslim community of academics had already been formed, and I was clearly not a part of it. And so it's taken me longer, I think, to sort of get involved, which just in turn makes it even more amazing that I'm here with all of you right now. I have very sort of intense feelings about that. And I was so in awe of your work that I ended up writing this book, American Muslim Women, Religious Authority and Activism, which, more than a prayer, which is what I wanted the title to be, which focuses on the 2005 Woman-Led Friday prayer and the khutbah that you gave, but does that in a way that I think also tells the story of Muslim women's activism in the US context. And so you appear frequently and prominently in each of the chapters, but there's also a way in which I think it tells, it's sort of a historical accounting that I'm really proud of, that there is in fact a record of this work that has been happening. And I moved after that book was published, and the sort of attendant backlash, which I think in interesting ways sort of mirrored the backlash against the prayer and against you. I can't recount the number of times I presented about that project, and then someone in the audience said, but women are not allowed to lead prayers. And sort of like it became this, who's gonna say it first, especially in community settings. And in a sort of move that to me made sense, because I've been basically studying Muslim women's activism, I decided somewhere during that time, and actually in relation to feminist Quran interpretation, that I was interested in issues of justice, specifically the question of domestic violence, because I wanted to see what the people I now call patriarchal Muslims would have to say about that. So it's one thing to argue that women should lead prayers, and it's a very, I think, specific thing to say, no, we're going to use the Quran to justify domestic abuse, right? So like a topic where I wanted to see what the excuses would be there. That's how it started. And I worked on this project for a very long time. It's an ethnographic as well as textual project that looks at American Muslim efforts against domestic violence. I shadowed advocates, I did interviews, and I looked at enormous amounts of textual material around 434, the version of the Quran that is often sort of brought up in this context. And I want to give a shout out to Laurie's article about that, which is still my very favorite piece about 434. And writing that book was incredibly hard, even though I wasn't directly working with victims of domestic abuse, even though many of the advocates are also survivors. It took me a very long time to write this book, and it came out almost exactly a year ago. And I have sort of stayed with these kinds of topics. I have several things that I'm planning to do, and then I'm going to be done talking. One is an article that is now accepted for publication that I'm nervous about, but I also thought was really important to write, which looks at arguments that patriarchal Muslim scholars have made against LGBTQI+ recognition. So this article is actually a product, a very, very late product of the conference at Duke that you invited me to. So it was a really important milestone for me to be there and to have that conversation. And I will admit that I'm kind of nervous about the response to that when it comes out, which will be something like 6 to 12 weeks from now. I'm trying to revise it. And I'm also involved in a participatory research project with Heart Women and Girls, an organization that was founded 10 years ago in Chicago to address sexual abuse in Muslim communities. That is sort of in infant stages right now, and obviously COVID has made it difficult to do the kind of research that I actually wanted to do with them. But that's going to happen in the long term. And I'm convinced that it is incredibly important to have that conversation and to have it now, and to ground it both in empirical research, but also in scriptural and textual frames. And so that is, it probably will, judging from how long the DV project took me, take a long time, but it's sort of a thing that's close to my heart. And so I'm trying to do all the things at the same time, which is a problem that I've had. Because initially I was always really worried that I would run out of things to do research about. And now I have the opposite problem. I have like these 4 things that I sort of think of on a piece of paper, and they're sitting there waiting for me to do something about them. So I had started a little bit of work with Musawa a few years back, and what has come out of that for me, I'm not sure what has come out of it for them, but what has come out of it for me is to very seriously think about activism as both religious practice and as production of knowledge. So I want to think much more carefully about where our notions of knowledge production actually reside, and how to maybe address the tension between scholars and activists that we so often talk about in contexts, in academic contexts especially, right? So like, as someone who has studied activists, I have sort of met this complication that it's actually not an ethical thing to do, to study activists and then criticize them for what they do. And so I had to ask myself, why am I doing this? What is my purpose in this? And so some of it is highlighting activist work, which I think is actually changing the world, maybe unlike some of the academic writing that some of us do. But also to contribute and to be part of these conversations. And I identify as a scholar activist, so this made sense to me. And then a project that I have now had some conversations about, and that I think will need to happen, is a book, inshallah, one day. There will be another book that I'm currently calling Patriarchal Islam, Sex, Gender, and Marriage in American Muslim Communities, in which I want to do something that seems really important to me at this point in time, because I have experienced, and I know that others in this community have as well, that the attacks against Muslim and Islamic feminists have really like gone into a frenzy in the past few years. There is a level of hostility and viciousness to the ways in which our work and our persons are being attacked, especially on social media, that always operates with the assumption that someone else will be able to decide whether we're actually Muslim and whether we're actually part of the spectrum of Islam. And so instead of like fighting back against that, what I'm planning to do in that book is actually chronicle and sort of create an archive of patriarchal arguments around gender and sexuality, and put them in their place to argue that patriarchal Islam is a particular sort of space on the spectrum of Muslim understanding and interpretation, but it's not the understanding, which is the claim that patriarchal Muslim scholars most often make. And so instead, I wanted to be in that place where it is one particular approach and one particular version, And in conversation with Keisha and other friends, I think I've also come to realize that it's really important in the US context to connect that analysis to the ways in which American Muslim scholars talk about race. Because it's actually a really interesting litmus test of how gender and race sort of intersect in Muslim communal discourses. And so that is the project right now, and I will see how it goes. Thank you.
Wow, that's fabulous. I'm going to try not to say something about it right now because I do want to. Instead, I'm going to introduce Keisha Ali, PhD at Duke University, is professor of religion and chair of the religion department at Boston University. Her research ranges from Islam's formative period to the present and focuses on Islamic law, gender and sexuality, and religious biography. Her books include Marriage and Slavery in Early Islam and Sexual Ethics and Islam, Feminist Reflections on Quran, Hadith, and Jurisprudence. She's currently working on an introductory book on women in Muslim traditions and a study of the gender politics of academic Islamic studies. You can read more about her work at www.keishaali.com. And Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you. Bismillah. It is absolutely an honor to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be part of this conversation, although like you, I would actually just want to hear more about what Juliana talked about. I mean, my stuff is really boring to me. But I will take my cue from her and I will give a little bit of backstory. I really love, Amina, the way you framed it as a journey to Islamic studies as opposed to more often a journey to Islam, because the journey to Islamic studies actually starts for me also, like for my colleague, in an activist space. So I came of age politically in the 1980s. It wasn't Palestine for me, but Central America. Although some of the people I was working with, college students and community members, were also very active in Palestinian causes. Anti-apartheid was also a thing for us in the mid-'80s. And at the same time, I was slowly coming to think in more complicated ways about sexuality and the role of access to birth control and these other things within American contexts. And so, you know, I got in trouble with my high school principal as editor of the school paper, both for the thing I published about apartheid and for the thing I published about Planned Parenthood, right? And that actually is probably most of what you need to know about me as a teenager to make sense of what has happened since. I went to Stanford and I studied Latin American history. I also took some classes on the Middle East, and we didn't have a scholar of Islam there. Stanford's religious studies program was, as somebody once memorably said to me, less than the sum of its parts at that time. And so there was a local rabbi who came and taught a class on Islam, which I took. But I left Stanford having done more work to learn about the Middle East and Muslims. I left as a Muslim. I left as someone who was reading Fatima Mernissi, reading the scholarship that had begun to be published at that time to educate myself in the ways that I wasn't able to do in the classroom. But I left with a degree in history and in feminist studies, having done work with women's grassroots mobilization in Brazilian shanty towns, and went to graduate school at Duke to do a degree in what I thought was going to be 20th century Brazilian history. And I started taking Islamic studies classes. That was going to be my outside field. And it didn't happen that way, right? I got most of the way through my coursework for history, and realized that I actually wanted to know more about Islam and about Muslim history. And by this time, I had read Quran and Woman. By this time, I'd read Women and Gender in Islam. And I had also learned to apply the historical lenses that were helping me make sense of 19th and 20th century Latin American women's movements, feminist movements, those archives, those narratives, to what was coming out in terms of a kind of Victorian modern rhetoric that I was hearing from Muslims, right? What was sort of the antecedent of today's hardened patriarchal discourses. Here is the sort of soft patriarchy that was being proffered about women's status in Islam, mostly soft. And I was recognizing the modern rhetoric as something I had also seen in Brazilian documents from the late 19th, early mid-20th century. And so that got me curious, and I ended up working on a dissertation project. I think I initially thought I was going to be looking at feminist Quran interpretation or modern family law in Muslim majority nation states. And instead, as a historian, I thought, well, what came before that? Okay, well, what's the underpinning of that? And I ended up writing about early Islamic law. My first book, however, even though the dissertation was really about the 9th century, maybe 8th to 10th century, if you kind of take it broadly, what you saw in the framing and what became sexual ethics is really this encounter that I was staging in my mind, but also with actual interlocutors and communities between what I was seeing today and then these early texts. Unfortunately, part of what happened in the process is that I sort of reified everything between 900 and 1900, as though that were one unified kind of modern Islam. You know, whatever. That was the way it was happening for me. And so sexual ethics really is the place where I was trying to work those things out. Marriage and Slavery is my attempt, still very much as a feminist with a kind of transformational agenda, but not so much an intra-Muslim agenda, at saying, let's understand this discourse, this legal discourse on its own terms and see what we can do with it, see where it makes sense. In part because I think very much like what Juliana is saying about the patriarchal archive, it's by understanding this as coming from somewhere, being constrained and shaped in particular ways, that we see that it's not universal, inevitable, or timeless, right? It is a local project of particular people choosing in particular ways, and we could choose otherwise, right? And things could be otherwise, which is, of course, you know, what activists always think, right? And so bringing those two things together. You mentioned in the biography that you gave that I'm working on 2 projects, the attempt to write a book that is an introduction to women in Muslim traditions. I mean, I'm basically a decade late writing this book, and there are all sorts of complicated reasons why the book isn't done. But part of it is because as someone who's aware of the power of grand narratives and totalizing narratives, I see all the pitfalls of the ways we normally do it. And yet it's actually really difficult not to do it that way. And so I'm in this continual process of sort of trying to get an arc, trying to get something useful, and then recognizing how pitiful it is and how it reinforces certain kinds of Sunni-centric, Arab-centric, teleological, jurisprudence-heavy kind of norms for what's going on. Or, you know, I write the whole thing and Southeast Asia just doesn't show up until, you know, we get a mention of Sisters in Islam in chapter 8. Like, it might actually end up being that way, but but that's hard. And so I am very much still working on that. But it is much harder. And this, again, goes to some of what Juliana was saying, to build things than to critique them, right? Critique is really easy and it's also necessary, but it's never sufficient. And writing an introductory text has certainly taught me that, or attempting to write one. The other thing that I'm working on is a book about the gender politics of academic Islamic studies. And that level of vitriol from some of our colleagues situated within Islamic studies, not just sort of random patriarchal preachers or lay figures in communities, but Muslim men in the academy, is really interesting. I mean, it certainly gives me fodder for things to write about, but it's also really frustrating that we still are where we are, you know, almost 20 years after I got my doctorate. That's a short summary that moves from, you know, teenage activist to present day chair of department. I didn't really talk about, you know, the fact that I had a part-time job as I was finishing my dissertation with the Feminist Sexual Ethics Project at Brandeis, funded by the Ford Foundation, working with Bernadette Bruton for a project on slavery's long shadow over the lives of women and girls. That brought me into conversation with a number of really interesting thinkers working on other traditions, including Monique Moultrie, who was a master's candidate at the time, including Gail Leibovitz, who is now professor at the American Jewish University. We don't remember. She's in LA, also ordained rabbi, who was basically writing the dissertation about Judaism that I was writing about Islam in terms of time and place and the kinds of texts and the kinds of arguments. So that was a really formative experience. I went to Harvard Divinity School and had a one-year research and teaching fellowship. I went back to Brandeis and had a 2-year postdoc. And that's where I was working on marriage and slavery, but also had the space to do sexual ethics and Islam. And that process of having light teaching responsibilities and institutional support for 3 years of fellowship, basically, after I finished my doctorate, before I started a tenure track job at Boston University in 2006, gave me the space to think really differently about what my academic career might look like. And I had small children at the time, and I didn't look for tenure track jobs outside of the Boston area. I had the luxury not to do that. And also the constraints, right, that meant that I couldn't do that. And that meant that I wasn't as worried as I think a lot of people are about producing the monograph first and producing peer-reviewed articles and doing all of the kinds of things to play a particular academic game. And the reason I mention this is because I think now that I've been promoted to full professor, I'm serving as department chair. I train graduate students, although not as many as get trained at UNC. I teach undergraduates. I think of my role in terms of Islamic studies, even though I do much less day-to-day activism kinds of things, I think of my role as being an advocate and a support for people in and outside of academia to both help them pursue paths that will be useful to them, to arrogate and appropriate what resources they can from existing systems in the support of projects that actually in some ways seek to undermine those systems, and to also work for and advocate transformation within those systems. And so part of what I'm trying to manage in this COVID moment is, yes, on the one hand, get my own publications moved, at least gently, towards publications so that they can hopefully be, additional fodder for conversation as we move forward. But I also take really seriously the fact that for some of my colleagues, whether they get things published or not is make or break for them in terms of academic stability. And then for other people, no matter how well they do, the system is not going to find a place for them. And so trying to find what I can do in my current situation to be a support and to be a resource and to be the harridan who screams the inconvenient things and everybody says, oh God, what a bitch, right? But I'm professionally secure enough that that's not a huge concern at this time. So thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. There is a little bit of feedback. I can hear you clearly because I do have on earphones. I can hear you clearly, but there's something else that's happening. And so anybody in the gallery, just double check that you are muted just to make sure that that's not the cause of it. Again, my tech skills are really limited. Thank you. Okay, Laurie Silver is a retired historian of early Sufism and the lives and practices of early pious and mystic women. She was also an activist in the gender jihad movement, working on the response to Dr. Wadud's 2005 prayer. From there, she organized women-led prayers with Nakia Jackson, co-founded and content edited the website progressiveislam.org, published scholarship on gender concerns in Islam, and most recently co-founded the Toronto Unity Mosque in 2009, a gender equal LGBTQ open worship space. Now she channels her academic and activist impulses into writing historical fiction, the Sufi Mysteries. Laurie, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum and bismillah. Alhamdulillah. You know, I mean, I'm going to have to really, everybody knows that I'm an extremely emotional person. And I'm a bit of a ditz. My ex-husband's mother once said to me as an insult, but I actually thought, wow, this is so accurate. She said that I was the smartest ditz she ever met. And I think that's really, really so exactly who I am. And I'm just so honored to be here and to be with all of these people and some of the people I see in the gallery too. I'm just, you know, I'm a bit overwhelmed. I don't have a big professional background to give. When I was in high school, I was really angry. You know, I've joked about my rage years lasting from 5 to 40. You know, I was super, super angry, and I was a punk kid in the 70s and nearly failed out of high school, worked junky jobs, and then realized I was going to need to have benefits at some point. So I went to junior college and discovered that I liked doing schoolwork because I had some really wonderful professors. But I thought, because I like to read, I'd be a high school English teacher. So I transferred to University of New York, State University of New York, Stony Brook, where I was getting a BA in American and English literature, my goal to be a high school English teacher, when I took a study of another culture course in order to graduate. And that was with William Chittick on Ibn al-Arabi and Meister Eckhart. And I read Ibn al-Arabi and I was completely blown away. This was everything I had ever wanted, and spoke to my rage, but also spoke to my desire for peace from that rage. And I think the only way I can describe it is to say is that I really needed a God who took responsibility for everything. And Ibn al-Arabi gave me that. Ibn al-Arabi gave me a God who took responsibility for everything. And this was what I needed to journey towards peace. But as I was doing that, William Chittick decided that he wanted me to be his graduate student. And I had already been accepted into the English department for a master's that would lead to a teaching degree. And he got my acceptance in that department transferred to his department, and he brought me into his program. And that's how I started my academic career. Purely accidental. This was not a thing that I had planned at all. And I made a fool of myself this way to Sunday because I had been a bad student in high school. I had probably a B average in my major, and I think I had a C average overall as an undergraduate. I did so badly on my GREs that it's a surprise that I even got into the graduate program at all, except for that I had some professors in the English department who were really behind me. My language skills are garbage. It took me so long to get a hold of Arabic at all, and finally be able to use it well enough for my scholarship. But Chittick was amazing, and he believed in me, and he brought me through everything and taught me how to be a very close reader of texts. But through all of this, I was becoming Muslim, and I was finding this path in Islam through Sufism, but also looking through the lens of Sufism. You know, if you're not looking at it in just one particular way, especially because I was focusing on early Sufism, you see the extraordinary diversity of thought and diversity of practice and diversity of experience of Islam, especially in the early period before the institutionalization of Sufism begins and a singular story starts to be told. I felt that Islam was as diverse as it was that I was seeing, but somehow, long story details I don't want to share, I ended up taking on an Islam spiritually and religiously that was very narrow. And I started to deny my own conscience. I had, for instance, prior to converting, took a study of another, not a study of another culture course, I took a historical independent study with a professor on LGBTQ Muslims and in history. And I had to know first that that was going to be a thing that was not going to be a problem before I would even convert, right? So there were all these things that were necessary for me. The position of women in Islam, all of these things were essential to my conversion. And yet, as my Islam progressed, I ended up falling into this trap of neo-traditionalism and becoming very narrow. And I can, and I know for personal reasons, what I really wanted was God to love me. And there were these people saying, for God to love you, you have to hate all these other things, and you have to hate yourself, and you have to deny your own conscience. And so, I got caught up in that, and it created a really difficult life for me in a lot of ways, which ended amazingly with your prayer, Dr. Wadud. Omid Safi said to me at an AAR conference, do you want to join this group, this progressive Islam group? I was like, what's that? And I had just been coming out of this personal journey away from that kind of Islam, but I had no idea where to go or where to take it with. I didn't know a lot of other Muslims. I had no idea what to do, and they were just organizing your prayer. It hadn't happened yet. And I was still so scared at that time that when we were all together at an organizing meeting in New Jersey prior to your prayer, Pamela Taylor was set to lead prayers, and I lied and said that I had my period so that I wouldn't have to follow her because I still couldn't get it out of my head. You know how this is anyway, that I couldn't do it. And I was secretly relieved that I had a trip planned while you were giving your prayer and I was going to be out of the country when you did it, because I felt like, well, this is a thing we have to do for a matter sort of civil disobedience, but it's wrong. I was still in that head at that time. It took so long to unravel and unwind these things. And to return to my conscience. And so your work, and specifically too, Quran and Woman and reading about 434, Keisha's work. I think I remember at one point writing Keisha an email after I read sexual ethics, where I used many expletives about, how powerful the work was for me, and the truth telling she was doing, Quran and Woman, the truth telling that you were doing. And then ultimately when I met Juliana, the kind of truth telling, all these women and men and other people who were doing all this truth telling. And through this group, I came to meet El Farouk, another truth teller, all these people who were just, who would just say what they needed to say. And this is really sort of my inner personality, is this completely unprofessional person who cannot control their mouth, who over time I've been trying to sort of learn how to do that. But I've, you know, it's not me. So I came through the other side. Now, in the meantime, I got a job at Skidmore College, where, you know, for complicated personal reasons, I was unable to finish my tenure track job there, and had to resign, and left and moved to Canada, where I remarried this extraordinary, lovely person who Dr. Wadood has met, and who, you know, and who said, if I ever left you for another woman, it would be Dr. Wadood. He, you know, I don't, if nobody's ever met Dr. Wadood, you know, her presence is like, wow. Anyway, and so, and I told myself I wasn't going to tell that story before we got started, and yet, you know, so that's my mouth. So in any case, you know, so I ended up here, and I ended up meeting El Farouk and Troy Jackson and other people, and we were going to the Noor Center, and I started teaching as an adjunct at University of Toronto, and we were at the Noor Center, which is wonderful and lovely, but we were all sort of frustrated that that there were certain limits to how how women and queer people could be at the front of things there, and we just decided, we were also too, I mean, to be honest, tired of fighting, and just thought, let's stop fighting, let's just build something. And so, you know, we decided to create this mosque. And in the beginning, some days it was just the three of us in El Farouk's living room, and other days there were more and more, and it's carried on. I eventually had to leave the mosque for various reasons, which we could talk about later if anybody wants to do that. It's an extremely difficult thing to do, to run a mosque, and the pastoral care that's involved in that I wasn't frankly up to doing, and ultimately had to leave for those reasons, and carried on with my work now. Ultimately, when I did my sort of my last bit of scholarship was this work on early pious and Sufi women, where I sort of said everything I wanted to say, you know, within the constraints of the word limit, and then went on and started writing this fiction. But the fiction started actually because I was pushed out of my adjuncting job at University of Toronto, and sort of left with nothing. And I had to find some place for this mouth to keep talking, to keep having something to say. And so my fiction sort of allowed me, like, you know, getting pushed out of that job was like the best thing that ever happened to me, in that, you know, my husband, who is this amazing, wonderful person, you know, who